todas lá. Dá uma última chamada.
Ah, tá. Mas a gente também tá só esperando a impressão do papelzinho do Guilherme. Só 5 minutinhos. Ela foi lá em cima só pegar, imprimir e já tá.
Beleza. We're waiting for the impression of your name. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. It's always difficult after lunch to start again, but we have a very interesting set of speakers and contributions. We're going to continue this discussion, very interesting discussion of this morning. I wanted to emphasize maybe one point that came out from the discussion is that this idea of sovereignty, is spreading, but the notion itself is not so clearly defined, right? So it can be used by several players in different manners. And I think what we need to understand is also coming to the topic of this panel in an economic context, what sovereignty means. What are the differences when it comes to, as opposed to having states asserting their prerogative to protect citizens in a digital environment? What does it mean when it comes to economic relations? And what is interesting, and that maybe not everybody knows, that the concept of sovereignty has been used for a long time in economic policy. The notion of consumer sovereignty has been coined, actually interestingly, by an Austrian. Here we have two Austrians in the room and in the conference. And the Austrian School of Economics was quite influential in shaping economic policy, in particular with regard to competition. So in a 1936 book, for the first time it was defined consumer sovereignty by William Harold Hutt, which defined consumer sovereignty as a situation in which the consumer, in his role of citizen, has not delegated to political institutions for authoritarian use the power which he can exercise socially through his power to demand or refrain from demanding. So this idea was simply that the consumer must not be restricted in his ability to choose in the market what he wants or what he doesn't want to buy. But the emphasis was very much on avoiding restriction from the states in order to promote a more liberal economy. Now, this idea then was basically captured for many years by the neo-liberal Chicago School of Economics that said, well, basically, as long as we ensure that consumers are getting goods for a price that is lower than what they are willing to pay, they are getting some economic surplus. And at the same time, if the producers are managing to sell the good for more than they would have been able to sell it for, they are also getting an economic surplus. So in that situation, if you think about it, the way that they were characterizing sovereignty was that the market chooses which part has the most surplus, and there was a lot of faith in the process of the market to operate and to preserve the will of consumers. More recently, there has been an attempt to redefine this notion of consumer sovereignty as something different from this neoclassical understanding of consumer welfare. So consumer welfare was the term that was used in economic policy for many years. In 2007, there was an article by Lande and Averit that referred to consumer sovereignty in a different manner. In particular, they said, is the power of consumer to define their own wants and the opportunity to satisfy those wants at prices not greatly in excess of the costs borne by providers of the relevant goods and services. So here it focused more on the consumer's surplus. It was more focused on the consumers getting a good deal in the market. And this started a discussion that also brought different dimensions of consumer sovereignty that were not only about prices. So it was about the ability to choose freely and without being restricted by market actors. So at the beginning it was more like a state-driven sovereignty, then it came to more market-driven or market-focused conception of sovereignty. And there is this tension still today. So in some states, when they enforce competition law, when they enforce economic laws, they are claiming that they are protecting sovereignty of consumers from the restrictions that the market is imposing. And the market, as we have seen from example this morning, claims that they are protecting the sovereignty of consumers from the states. So there is still, this tension, and I think here the panels today will be able to bring some very interesting connection between these different dimensions of sovereignty. So we will start from the local level. We'll start from example of economic sovereignty in Brazil, and we will move broader to the region of Latin America, and then to the Far East with India and China. So very interesting comparison of concept of sovereignty. So we'll start with our colleague who actually was not in the program. It's a surprise that we have brought to you, Guilherme Musselin, who is a researcher in our platform governance group at CTS FGV. He's just been delivered the nameplate, and he has done some very interesting research on algorithmic sovereignty. So what it means to give sovereignty through transparency, and in particular in economic relations that are given in gig economy workers scenarios. So I think we can start from that, and then we'll move forward. I will introduce each speaker after the previous talk has been presented. So Guilherme, thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you, Nicolo. Good afternoon to everyone. As you cannot see, I'm not in the program, so surprise, surprise. We are going to talk about app-based workers and digital sovereignty. But before we go ahead, I would like to start with a thought-provoking question to you all. Do you believe that digital sovereignty is achievable when it comes to individuals in our current technological landscape? I don't have the answer yet. I don't think you have the answer too, but I'm inclined to respond no. And I'm going to tell why I think that way. So it's a fact that today we're witnessing a profound transformation in how we conceive and apply the concept of sovereignty, which was originally developed for governments and for states. But the rise of the digital dimension has introduced unique features that challenge the traditional notions of power, power that nowadays is mostly private, but also control, self-governance, autonomy, and territory. So various aspects contribute to this, namely the failed competition in digital ecosystems, the unchecked exploitation of data and personal profiles, the lack of collective participation in the construction of this dimension, and the concentration of digital systems in the hands of a few transnational agents. And of course, the dependence that it comes with that, relying in their services. So the best example I could give you happened this morning. When we woke up, we saw that several systems were failing because of a system provided by Microsoft, banking, flights, and so on. And this demonstrates that our reliance in few companies is not healthy. But build on that idea, we can say that all of these interconnected factors can lead to almost total control over informational flows and everything that comes with these informational flows, which nowadays is nearly everything: money, people, products, communication, jobs, and so on. You can name it. So this control is closely tied to surveillance and monitoring, which results in the deprivation of sovereignty, not only of states and institutions and corporations, but especially in our context of individuals, which allows platforms to impose their conditions, to impose their interests with immense freedom and opacity, which leads to abuse to consumers, to workers, and to citizens. So in this scenario, in the case, going to the case of app-based workers, we have a clear example on that. So imagine that all of you are ride-sharing drivers. You drive for Uber. You can say that you're free, but every decision about your workday, when you drive, where you go, how you drive, how much you make, everything is influenced by an invisible force, which is the algorithm. So it promises, of course, flexibility, but often it dictates your work life in ways that you don't completely understand, or you don't even know that is going on. But what this fact is known as opacity of digital systems, also the lack of transparency that undermines how people behave regarding technologies, both in online and offline environments. But despite this misleading, this fake freedom in ride-sharing business models, the reality is quite the opposite. Well, we have direct and indirect stimuli, carrots and sticks, gamification, manipulation of works to behave in ways that benefit only the platform. We have also differential pricing, bonuses for low availability places, and several other kind of benefits, along with sanctions for non-compliance. So these algorithms, they can perpetuate discriminations and make decisions that seem very arbitrary to drivers. Just like in the case of deplatformization, the exclusion of the driver of the platform. So it should be clear that while all of these digital systems offer convenience for everybody, they also pose significant risks for drivers, not only for drivers, but the consumers too, and their independence, because the algorithm, they set all the aspects of the service with high opacity. So this lack of transparency in how these algorithms operate means that drivers often fail to understand why certain rides will appear or will not appear on their screen, as well their ratings or the taxes or they pay, undermining trust in the platform, but more important than that, undermining the legal protections that are traditionally offered to regular employees. So all of this make the freedom idealized by these platforms an illusion, actually. This is the very reason of the issue of the misclassification of these works in several jurisdictions, including here in Brazil. As you can see in legal cases, some courts say that they are employees. Other courts say that they are independent contractors. We have no definitive answer. So the question is, are they digitally subordinate, or are they independent? Are they sovereign? Individual digital sovereign, in this case, we will refer to return to self-determination, to independence, to real autonomy for people who should make their own decisions in an informed manner. And this idea also relates to the people having control over their data, over their digital devices, and any other kind of technology in their lives, regarding being consumption or work, or just enjoying a service for enjoyment. So in the context, specifically in ride sharing, this translates into the ability of the worker to make their own decisions, and which will involve the following: transparency. Workers need clear information about how algorithms make decisions that affect their worker conditions and worker rights. Accountability. There should be mechanisms for workers to challenge unfair algorithmic decisions and also to seek redress. Participation. Works should have a voice in designing and implementing the technologies that affect their work. And education. Workers should be provided with training and resources to understand and to navigate these kind of digital tools and algorithms used in their work. So in light of all of this situation, Brazil is trying to move towards regulating app-based workers, especially drivers. In a book that I wrote in 2021, I have identified over 10 bills aiming to regulate this kind of workers. Some were less protective, recognizing them as independent, self-employed, while others were considered more protective, recognizing the digital subordination and classifying them as employees. All of those bills fell through. But earlier this year, we saw the federal government proposing the Bill 12 to 2024. In its original version, the need for transparency would be included. But this transparency was not overall transparency. It was limited mostly to pay. So we, from FGV, we were invited to make some contributions and adaptations to this bill regarding constructing a new version, especially in algorithmic transparency. In our suggestions, we covered several key areas that we understand that were important, including ride details, monitoring criteria, driver scoring and evaluation systems, conditions for blocking, suspension, or exclusion of drivers. But not just that, we also addressed the need to instruct drivers of how system works and how and why decisions are made. We also said that it's important to know how driver data and behavior could influence these decisions, the categories of monitored actions, and the measures the platforms could take to mitigate the risks involved in providing the service for the worker. We also included provisions for drivers' data interoperability, provisions for data access for public authorities to support supervision of these companies, but also to help at the development of public policies for transportations, for example. But this suggestion, did not receive strong political support, but we expected that. As a result, many of these suggestions were not included in the final bill, such as human review of automated decisions, which we consider essential, especially in the case of the imposition of sanctions or in the cases of deplatformization due to the possible influence of big tech companies on the political will. So in going to the end of my presentation and answering the question I posed at the beginning, I do not believe that digital sovereignty is achievable as it stands. We are in a scenario nowadays where the power of digital platforms is too vast too opaque and too unsupervised to be contained by regulations that are currently too tech-friendly, big tech-friendly. But I still believe in the transformative power of transparency, accountability, and education. We need to empower these works. We need to empower consumers. We need to empower citizens with knowledge. And more than knowledge, we need tools to make them able to navigate and challenge these digital landscapes and these digital companies so that we can reclaim autonomy and foster a digital environment where sovereignty is not an illusion, but turns out to be a tangible reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guilherme. Very stimulating and concrete examples. I think that those criteria, those recommendations, if you ask, everybody in the street here at the university, if it wouldn't be good to have more transparency over how drivers are nudged, are deplatformized, or are scored in the platform, I think everybody would agree that that transparency is very much welcome. So there is also a question about the political process, because we did work with the committee members that were drafting this, what is called here, substitutive bill of the legislative proposal on Uber. We submitted these recommendations, and then the political process is complicated, but at some point they were removed. So we have also to ask ourselves whether the Congress is really expressing the sovereignty of the people, or it's subject to some other dynamics. So that is a point that connects very well with the next presentation, the next set of remarks. So we have with us Marina Lucena, who is a PhD candidate at UERJ, University of Rio de Janeiro, and a member of our research group on platform governance. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about the concept of sovereignty within elections. So one of the key moments in which people are supposed to exercise their sovereignty is through the voting process. But are we sure that we are in control over the flow of the electoral of the information in the electoral period? So this is what the tribunal, the electoral tribunal, is doing, and there's some interesting concepts that have arisen over the last couple of years regarding how this tribunal controls the information that is propagated, and so Marina will offer some reflections about that. Thank you very much, Marina.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Nicolo and FGV Rio Law, for the opportunity to be here today. As Professor said before, I am a researcher at the Center for Technology and Society here at FGV. And in our research group, we are currently working in a project to better understand the role of the Brazilian Superior Electoral Court, which is called TSE in Portuguese. I will tell TSE now on. And the role of the Brazilian Superior Electoral Court in the fight against the dissemination of fake news, especially during the electoral period here in Brazil. Even though it's still an in-progress work, it's not finished yet, today I will discuss some interesting issues concerning the concept of abuse of power, which is quite unique to Brazil, especially the way it is applied to our electoral legislation. So we know that in democratic regimes, the integrity of the elections is extremely important to express popular sovereignty. In Brazil, one issue that is frequently under observation in order to preserve the integrity of the electoral process is the abuse of power from candidates, coalitions, and political parties. The Brazilian electoral justice and our legal system in general tries to prevent that some candidates have an unfair advantage from their economic and power conditions more broadly. So the main idea is to keep fair conditions during the elections, before and during elections, that is, keep the elections with integrity. That is the main idea. According to the focus of our research, there are 3 different types of abuse of power. All of them are crimes, and all of them must be prohibited during elections. First of all, the abuse of political power, also called abuse of authority. It occurs when someone, usually no authority, uses their position of power to benefit a candidate, a specific candidate, which may be themselves, or to benefit a political party, a coalition, whatever. The authority can be someone who occupies a function, a job, a position in the Brazilian state. A very important case, a milestone in this topic, occurred in Brazil in October 2020, when the TSE decided to seize Deputy Franciscini's state mandate. He was elected for Paraná in 2018, and the TSE's decision was based on the fact that the Deputy Franciscini spread disinformation about the electronic voting system here established in Brazil, and as a consequence, TSE decided to declare him ineligible for 8 years. The second type of abuse of power is abuse of economic power. That type of abuse is defined on the TSE's election glossary that is available on TSE's website as the use in an abusive way before or during the electoral campaign of materials or human resource that represent economic value, seeking to benefit a candidate, a political party, a coalition, affecting the normality and the legitimacy of the elections. So, in other words, someone with relevant economic conditions intervenes to produce, to distribute, or to buy something related to the election. In our research, we focus on one specific product, online disinformation. So it happens when someone uses bots, creates faking accounts, or pay groups to create and share false content online. So during elections, we know that it's regular and even expected that the candidates will use economic resource to promote their own campaigns. It's normal. But it can be done in an abusive or excessive way, as we are discussing right now. So to clarify, the concept of abuse of economic power can occur outside the electoral legislation. It's common in antitrust law, for example, but our specific focus here is on the use of this concept, abuse of power, and it's controlled by the electoral court. Finally, the third type is the unlawful or misuse of the media. We know that media is responsible for providing information for all citizens, and it's an essential activity, especially during election campaigns. The misuse happens when the media is used in an abusive way, in an excessive way, for example, providing unequal information or providing information in a manipulative way only about one candidate, for example. To summarize what we are discussing until now, in general, the electoral laws and the electoral courts in Brazil act to preserve the fairness and equality for all candidates during elections. And to achieve this, there are several norms, several standards to define what is allowed to the candidates and what is not allowed. In the digital context, power abuse frequently takes place with the mass dissemination of disinformation online. Different types of false information are created and shared online. Every day it happens, we know. And usually this type of information, they usually look like real news. And this falsehood is used during elections to obtain an unfair advantage, especially for a candidate, or to damage someone's candidacy. Misinformation, when it's disseminated through massively and through different media types, makes the election unbalanced and provides political advantage to one candidate or one coalition or one political party. Our constitution brings the provision about the obligation to preserve the normality and legitimacy of election against the influence of economic power. So even our constitution tries to maintain the fairness of elections. And Brazil also has different laws regarding this topic, trying to establish standards and norms about the elections and how it should happen. And for example, there is the law 9504 that contains some guidelines about abuse of economic power. For example, it establishes a limit to how much money each campaign can use, and it establishes also consequence if this limit is not followed. And we have another example, the complementary law 64 that establishes the consequence of the abuse of political power. As we saw before, it can lead to one's ineligibility for a period of 8 years. We also have some norms, some resolutions from the TSE. I will speak briefly about 3 of them. The resolution 23735, published very recently in this year. In this resolution, TSE defined what can be considered as an electoral crime. And one of them is abuse of power. The Article 6, Paragraph 3, consider, for example, that the use of texting apps to promote the mass messaging with misinformation, false information, or manipulated content to cause harm to someone's candidacy or to the opponent image or in benefit of one of the candidates is considered as abuse of economic power. We also have the resolution 23732, also from this year, that establishes the prohibition to use in the electoral context content created artificially to share false or decontextualized information, because they consider that in this case, the potential to harm the electoral process and the electoral integrity in our country. This resolution also brings the one provision about deepfakes that is very common situation in our country and other countries as well. And the resolution, finally, the resolution 23610 about electoral advertising. This resolution was updated this year as well. And one article established that online content may only be amplified to promote and benefit candidates. So this resolution and this article established a prohibition to boost content to harm candidates. And it includes the dissemination of false or decontextualized content as well. So to bring 2 relevant cases about this in Brazil. One important case in which the argument of abuse of economic power, and a very famous one, was the inquiry 4874, ruled by the Federal Supreme Court in Brazil, the STF, and through which Elon Musk was investigated. I think it's a very famous case. And in this case, Justice Alexandre de Moraes described that Elon Musk's behavior was unacceptable. In this case, he shared false information, initiated a campaign against the TSE and the STF, in addition to promoting disobedience against Brazilian judicial decisions. The act from Musk, the CEO of X, former Twitter, was considered a probable case of economic power abuse. So just to mention, we know that in general, the candidates and politicians are responsible for responsible for abuse of power before or during elections. However, this case was different because Elon Musk is not a politician, he's not a candidate, he's a CEO of a company, but this is a particularity of this case. And another important case in Brazil happened recently as well, was the campaign of the big techs here against the draft bill 2630. In this case, the federal police in Brazil understood that it was a case of economic power abuse. In this case, some social media companies, for example, Telegram and Google, decided to act to avoid this law to be approved, they shared information criticizing the draft bill, persuaded state users to go against it, using, among other means, false information about the project. So to summarize, in Brazil we are dealing and acting against abuse of economic power, and in the electoral context, this has been made very strongly by our courts, including the Superior Electoral Court, the TSE. The idea is to avoid inequality in elections, providing fair chances to all the candidates, despite the difference in their economic conditions, their economic power, more broadly. And more recently, dealing with abuse of power is very often a fight against the spread of false information online through social media platforms. We still have some difficulties to deal with this challenge, of course. Some suggestions would be to improve the legal definition of what is considered as abuse, abuse of power, abuse of authority, abuse of the media, the difference between these three types of abuse of power, and what the most situations in which this abuse occur are, among other suggestions. So, in conclusion, digital sovereignty in the electoral context crucially depends on the way in which citizens are protected from undue influence by candidates and by and the media. Therefore, more clarity regarding the use of these concepts and how they are measured, particularly taking into account the complexities of digital environment, would be gladly welcome to allow society to monitor the extent to which this is done effectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina, for this very detailed overview of the legal framework when it comes to abuse of power in the electoral context, what the TSA has done. And I think you showed two important things. One that is shown in the example of Elon Musk is that this concept is expanding. Traditionally it was used for politicians, candidates, parties, but in this case they also perhaps because of the digital environment that it becomes so central in spreading news, it is now adding another component to the arsenal of the tribunal. And the other one is that there is another set of actors that are also engaged in preventing abuse of economic power. The case that you mentioned that was about the campaign by Google and Meta regarding the bill the fake news bill. This is a case that was submitted to CAGE, the competition authority, and they don't have so clear standards about what is an abuse of economic power that influences the political process, which is something that is usually done by the electoral tribunal. So there is a need for more clarity and more coordination among the different actors. So I think it was excellent in that regard. Okay, now we transition to another framework that deals with economic sovereignty. That is in the case of Chile. So we have here Andrés Calderón, who is a doctoral candidate at PUC Chile, and he is a visiting researcher here at CTS, and he has been recently appointed judge at the Tribunal for Competition Matters in Peru, and he's also written a book on the economic constitution in Peru. So he has a lot of experience and writings on the concept of economic sovereignty, or related to the concept of economic sovereignty. In particular, something that is very interesting that we would like to hear from you is this notion of subsidiarity in the implementation of economic policies. So just as a brief introduction, subsidiarity may mean not just that the smallest level of government is involved in creating a policy, so at the municipal instead of the state or federal level, but also that something might be done by the market and doesn't need to be regulated by the state if the market can already take care of it, right? And this has some interesting implication in the context of digital public infrastructure that is also the topic of the next panel. So if you could elaborate on those topics, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much, Anders.
Yes, thank you, Nicolo. I want to start by thanking Nicolo, Luca, and the whole team, the whole organizing team of FGV Law for these 3 amazing and stimulating days. And I would also like to thank them for the caipirinhas that I know they are going to be served right immediately after this panel. Okay, that was clickbait, obviously, right? Yeah, that was disinformation, but still I managed to wake you up after a good lunch. So now going into a more serious note, unluckily, when we speak about digital sovereignty, and as we have seen in the very interesting panels that we had in this morning and some other panels that address this issue during CPTP LATAM in the previous 2 days, we know that our main focus is on the autonomy that states can have when providing digital service and providing regulation and understanding the digital ecosystems with respect to other states or other sources of power, economic power, mainly multinational, big, large players. And I would say that the concept of sovereignty and the main focus that it might take, it's very dependent on the context, on the socio-economical and political context that this concept needs to be applied. So when Nicole invited me to join this panel, what immediately rose to my head was, okay, the concept of subsidiarity. Because I would think that for the Peruvian landscape, and probably also for Chile, that concept would have an important impact on the discussion of digital sovereignty. So when we try to consider individual sovereignty as part of this large concept, we would probably think about the autonomy of individual subjects to engage and participate and enjoy digital services with respect not only to large companies, but also with regard to other sources of power, such as the state, right? So can somebody make the claim that over-dependency on the state as a provider can also be considered as a limitation to digital sovereignty? And I would think that this is an issue that would deeply be of importance for many Latin American countries, such as Peru, in which over-dependence on the government and large public companies generated during the 70s and the 80s mainly big problems that ended up in scarcity, huge debts, default for payments, recession, economic crisis. So that is why, taking into account that background, in some Latin American countries, at the highest level, at the constitution, we have adopted a rule to limit the power for the states to engage in economic activity. That is the concept of subsidiarity, that it's well established in the Peruvian constitution as well as in the Chilean constitution. I would think that at least the general provisions are also established in the Brazilian constitution. So I'm gonna limit obviously my concepts and to the Peruvian experience, which is the one that I'm most familiar with. But as Nicolo mentioned, it's not only deference to the smallest, more close instance of the government instead of the largest and the largest instance, like the federal level or the national level, depending on the type of administration that we have. But it also means that the government can only intervene in economic activities as a provider when there is lack of supply by private companies and when other requirements are met. For instance, in the case of the Peruvian Constitution, we need an express approval by the Congress for the government to provide direct services, direct economic services, and we also need it to be justified in the highest public interest. But one key element to the application of this constitutional rule is whether the activity performed by the government is to be considered actually economic activity or it can be deemed as a public function. Because if it's a public function, if it's a public service that the government has to provide, then we wouldn't apply the subsidiarity rule. So, for instance, just making a couple of examples of the Peruvian jurisprudence on that topic, health services as a general rule, educational service as a general rule have been considered public services, public functions, and in those cases the subsidiarity rule is not applied. However, some other cases were considered against the Constitution because the government or some instance of the government were providing services that already met the demands of the public, such as some veterinary services, such as health, not health, aesthetic medical services, and restaurant services as well. We may have some critical cases, some inconsistencies. For instance, one case reached the Constitutional Tribunal in which renting a stadium for entertainment purposes, like for concerts, was considered to be like an essential governmental function, which doesn't seem like very clear to me, but that's what the Constitutional Tribunal ruled. So while subsidiarity might not be considered a framework for sovereignty, it is a framework for the practical legal scope and lengths to which states can go to secure digital sovereignty. So let me just, well, we can think of some services that we might want to be provided, to be guaranteed by the states, such as internet connectivity, physical or digital servers, computational capacity such as cloud storage and cloud computing, and digital payments. But whether, even if the state has the economic capacity to provide those services, then we would need to put that possibility to the test of subsidiarity. So I'm just going to take this couple of final minutes to address one activity that I know is of interest of many people in the room, and it will be discussed in the next panel, which is the digital payments activity. So when the pandemic hit in Peru, digital wallets started to grow exponentially. Nowadays, it's the largest tool for digital payments in Peru. But the two largest digital wallets are owned by two of the largest private banks. And while this prompted new digital payment providers to enter the market, such as e-money, digital wallets, prepaid cards, providers of QR codes, among others, most of them experience the problem of interconnection to bank providers, to access to the information of bank accounts, and I know that that has been the case as well, for instance, in some services here in Brazil that end up in cases before Cadena. Very few of these new providers had actually reached agreements with the banks, and And another key element to have in mind is that in Peru, only 52% of the population has a banking account. So financial inclusion, it's both a necessity and a goal for national authorities. Therefore, 2 years ago, the central bank started fostering the interoperability process, issuing a regulation that makes interoperability mandatory for digital payments, for payment systems as a whole, actually, but giving companies a timeline with several stages and milestones to achieve. Actually, we are still in the middle of that process, and it is a slow process. There are some issues with the compatibility of networks, with security, data protection, logistics, and of course, as you may think, there are some incumbent players that are that do not have the incentives to interconnect. So, with this background, we could ask if DPI, digital public infrastructure, is needed. I would think so, as a general thought, but obviously this needs to be sorted out and structured in a way that can be understood that it's only serving a public function and therefore does not enter into conflict with the subsidiarity rule. And even when providing DPI, and I think I talked about this topic with some of you, then you would need to address the issue of whether the regulation can limit the capabilities of the digital payment service providers that interconnect to this DPI to charge some fees, to pass on some of the costs of the interconnection to end consumers. And I know that this is an issue that is being discussed in some of the countries that are starting to develop those DPIs, and probably it could lead to some pushback by private companies that wouldn't want the market to be that intervened, and maybe if they have something like a subsidiarity rule, that would create a new legal discussion that could limit, again, the length and the scope of the so-called digital sovereignty. So just to wrap up, I would think that when making these discussions, it is important to check on the historical background and the political and economical and sociological needs of the countries, because probably digital sovereignty, depending on the jurisdiction, might have a different focus, or they could have a different set of preferences than some of the other very important issues or factors of digital sovereignty that we all know. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. It's very interesting. First of all, apologize for saying that you were going to speak about Chile, whereas you're from Peru. Obviously, there is an issue of pisco sour between the two, so maybe we can solve that during the drinks. But
I love Chile, but I love Peruvian pisco more.
it's better, Peruvian. Okay, but the other point related to the culture, I think it was interesting when you mentioned the case of the stadium as being a public service that is essentially public and does not have to obey to the principle of subsidiarity. Maybe in Brazil, the stadium is of such importance that it should. So you can see the culture there. Culture of football here is strong. Maybe there is more of a case for that. But also the argument about these subsidiarity rules and principles applying in other countries, I think is valid. I've heard some criticism here about the intervention that was done through PICS by mandating the banks to create this instant payment mechanism as being unconstitutional because it could have been done from private-driven initiative. And then there is where I think there's a very good connection with the next presentation, because if we look at the system like China, in China, they do have this approach of stimulating. So it's not the same as leaving the market to create something, but it's not also full intervention by saying we are going to provide the infrastructure, but especially in the context of AI, there is a kind of facilitative role of the state where they stimulate, they foment the creation of an ecosystem. So we would like to hear now from Aifan Ma, who is a professor at Peking University and a CyberBRICS fellow here at the center. What's the position, the approach that China is taking with regard to AI sovereignty, both in the restrictive and in the facilitative part? So you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicolo. And I also wanted to express my gratitude to Professor Luca Belli and also my colleagues Anna, Giovanni, and also Joa for their very careful organization for this panel. Well, so today I'm going to talk about the Chinese regulation of the AI. I will put the emphasis on the two-level regulation, which correspond to what Nicolo talks about, the facilitative regulation and the restrictive regulation. All right, so I wanted to start with kind of looking at how this AI sovereignty is being served, is being implemented in China. So I think it's important to have a look at the dynamics, the regulation dynamics at the two levels of the Chinese regulation. So one is at the central level. So at the central level, actually, so the regulator, so normally is the cyberspace administration. So this is mainly a political regulator. Normally, its responsibility is to censor online speeches, so to make the content regulation. And progressively, the CAC has become the most important internet regulator in China. So today, its bureaucratic competencies are being extended to AI as well. So this is a very, very crucial regulator in China. And then at the national level, so the regulation takes two functions. So one is to facilitate the things by releasing the investment policy or the technological innovation or very preferential investment policies as well. And then there is also the restrictive regulation, meaning that the state is going to put the ethical regulations or the technical standards, so to kind of make sure that the firms comply with the ethical issues. And then the regulatory risk, this one I will talk about later. And then for the resources, the central regulator has a very huge capacity to make binding rules. And then at the local level, which is very interesting in China, so at the local level, normally it's the economic regulator who are in charge of the AI regulation. So normally they are the local outpost of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And then at the local level, the main function for the regulation is to facilitate the things. So the facilitative regulation. And then the priority is to ensure a competitive liberalization. You know, since the economic opening up in 1978, then the local governments are given very huge competencies for making economic policies, economic regulations. So they are sovereign when it comes to economic policy. So the national government is doing politics, the local government doing economics. And then, so there, if one province, let's say Beijing, takes liberal policy, then the other provinces will follow suit, because the local governments compete a lot in China, because the governor wants to be promoted to a higher position, so they are under very huge pressure to compete. And then at the local level, so the China is a unitary state, which is true, but actually the provinces and the municipalities, they have their own legislature, which is able to make binding rules also. So here I wanted to look at, so to combine the Chinese way of regulating AI in combination with the geopolitics. So at the central level, so due to the geopolitical pressure, there is actually a shift of the regulation priority. So here I take the 2019 as the dividing line. Before the 2019, the regulation is mainly takes on a facilitative regulation, and after 2019, the regulation has kind of simultaneously kind of has the facilitative role and the restrictive role. All right, so the digital sovereignty, so Professor Bailey defined the digital sovereignty as the capacity to understand, to develop, and to regulate digital technologies. And then another is also an Italian scholar. So he also kind of takes the same understanding by defining the digital sovereignty as the control of data, the software, the hardware, the infrastructure. So the regulation is actually a policy instrument for serving the digital sovereignty at the central level and at the local level of Chinese governance. So the regulation, so for both dimensions of the regulation, are used as an instrument to serve the Chinese digital sovereignty. So before 2019, actually, so at that moment, the USA is the principal competitor for China. I mean, the geopolitical competitor. So both the way in which the Chinese government is releasing different regulations is in close lockstep with the White House. So actually, in 2016, there is a 3-year implementation plan for the Internet Plus. And then in 2017, there is this very kind of a very long-term regulation in China, so the development plan for the next generation of AI. So in this one, I actually published a small book in French. I encourage you to have a look if you can see. So this is a very ambitious plan because it tries to set the objective of turning China into a global AI innovation center by 2030. And it also kind of lays down 6 priority tasks so to serve this long-term objective. And this regulation is mainly a facilitative regulation. So even though it does include some dispositions about the data security protection, the privacy protection, but the main thing is really to kind of to facilitate the things, to lay the conditions for to allow firms to innovate. And after 2019, the EU comes onto stage to become a normative setting power because the EU today has become a global highland for AI regulation. And then, so the Chinese government was under huge pressure because it does not want to be kind of at a passive position vis-a-vis the EU in the rule making, especially for the transnational AI governance. So from 2019 onwards, the Chinese government actually is also taking the restrictive regulations so to innovate in the regulation of AI. In 2019, there is the 8 governance principle of AI. So the human-friendly, the equity, respect of privacy, security, accountability, and agile governance. And what is really spectacular is the National Science and Technology Ethics Commission. I really look at the screen difficultly. Nicolo, can I stand up maybe? It's
Of
better,
course.
I think.
Please.
Yeah, so the National Science and Technology Ethics Commission, this is a very important organization in China because it's kind of, normally the Chinese government always tries to facilitate the things, so not to kind of to hinder from innovation. But here, so this organization is kind of to set up the rules for firms to comply with the ethical standards. And then here I wanted to give you 3 examples for the restrictive regulation of AI in China. So you can see in 2021, so there is the algorithmic recommendation for the Internet News Information Service. So for this regulation, actually the government requires the firms to respect the transparency for algorithms. And also, for the first time, the regulation says that the Chinese citizens can refuse to be personalized in the, so they can refuse the personalized services. And then there is also the deep generative services, also in the Internet News Information Services. So this is also a very important regulation, because it kind of, for the first time also, it says that the Chinese firms, when you try to generate new contents, you must make sure that the data you use for training your algorithms must be safe. So there must be no risks for the ideology things in China. And the most recent regulation is the generative AI the generative artificial intelligence service. So this is a provisory regulation, but today is the most comprehensive AI regulation. So in this one, the China actually learns from the EU by introducing the risk-based approach of AI regulation. And another thing, which is the fact that the China kind of says that we should use a tolerant and prudent approach to AI because, well, you know, today most AI firms are kind of based in the United States and in China. So the Chinese government does not want to cut the opportunities for the firms. So we restrict their freedom of action, but at the same time, the Chinese government also wants to be tolerant. So not to, because all these big players, they are either American or Chinese, so we don't want to cut their competitiveness at the international level. All right, here I wanted to talk a bit about the local regulators. In China, you know, as I said before, the central government codify, and then the local regulators experiment, okay? So because the local governments have all their autonomy for making innovative economic policies, and then the kind of the already, so they are free to take economic policy, and then if the national government judges these policies as efficient, then they can be written into the national regulation. I give you one example from Shenzhen. Shenzhen has made a very innovative policy, meaning that, well, if the researchers manage to overcome some bottlenecks in the AI, so they can hold a long-term property rights over their findings. So this is a big incentive for the researchers. And then the local governments have also made huge progress in the AI application. So I wanted to present you some pictures. that I took from my field research in China. So here you can see this is a driverless car in Wuhan. Actually, in Beijing, you can also see quite a lot of driverless cars there. So I actually went to Beijing. There is an industrial park. They specially created this park for experimenting driverless cars. So here you can see the name of the car is Reddish Run. So it's very practical. You download the app, you click it, and then you can have a driverless car. There is actually a person inside this car, but this person does not drive. The car drives itself, and it's pretty comfortable. And then, so this is a robot. In China, you can also see quite a lot of robots like this in supermarkets, in hotels, in restaurants, quite often. So this is also due to the innovation policies by the local governments. So here I take it in the mall supermarket, which is near my house. So this is, you can see the robot is cleaning the floor actually. And then I remember I went to a conference in Shanghai, and then you went into the hotel, and then you can you take the floor, you take the elevator at the same time as the robot. The robot can actually, they know how to take the elevator, and then they get off. They can transport the food, things like that. It's pretty fanciful. And then this is the smile to pay. This is also very common in China. So you scan your face, and then you finish the payment. All right. So I wanted to combine the AI regulation in China with the geopolitical competition. So today I want to see that the China is a big player in the global AI race. So the two pressure I wanted to see is kind of there is the competitive pressure from the USA, and also the institutional pressure from the EU. So basically today there is the diversification of the factors which can influence how a national government can perform in the geopolitical competition. On the one hand, you should innovate in technologies, but on the other hand, you should also kind of be able to make innovative regulations, so to control the risks. So both factors are becoming very important. So here I recommend you one article by Anna Castellano and Selga about these three effects: Brussels effect, Beijing effect, and the California effect. So there is actually a very strong geopolitical competition between the three, because all these centers, all these countries wanted to be a global center for AI. So there is a competition over the norms and the regulation systems.
Can we reach conclusions?
Yeah. I will conclude now. Okay. So to conclude, so I wanted to emphasize two things. The first thing is really to unleash so in China actually the one dynamic is to unleash the potential of the local governments for the AI innovation. And then the second one is also kind of a suggestion for the other BRICS countries, because I'm a research fellow in the Cyber BRICS project, is to let the bullets fly. So this is a famous movie in China. So what I want to see is that to kind of to give the firms the autonomy for experimenting, so not to be too conservative or restrictive for the AI regulation, so to reach a balance between these two dimensions. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Fantastic overview of what's going on there. And very interesting this notion that the local government is experimenting. It seems to some extent similar to the subsidiarity that we discussed. So I understand that then the local government does not have a restrictive posture. Usually it's more facilitative type of regulation. But just on the bullet fly, the bullet can also hurt. So it's dangerous. But yeah, I want to watch the movie now, definitely. Okay, now we move to another Asian country, India. Well, here we have seen that there are different postures. I wonder how India is reacting to China and to all the economic superpowers, how the concept of digital sovereignty informs the economic policies of India, and what's the role of digital public infrastructure that we hear a lot about India as a possible long-term solution to these issues. So, Nikhil, I have been introduced. You are the founder of Media Nama. You've been already around for CPD Piratam, but thank you very much also for joining us here. You have the
Thanks,
floor.
Nicolo. I'm going to take a cue from my Fang and also step down. I like to walk around when I speak, but
feel sovereign.
You spoke about the Beijing effect. India wants to have the India effect or the Delhi effect, so to speak, and where that. And one area where there has been a Delhi effect is in the idea of banning Chinese apps, like TikTok especially. So when you look at it, different countries are looking at banning TikTok from a sovereignty perspective. The Americans considered it. Europe is also playing around with that idea. Many countries have stopped using TikTok for, government phones can't use them anymore. And, one thought process is that this was born out of sovereignty. At that point in time, there were clashes between soldiers across the line of actual control. And between China and India, soldiers died on both sides. The first thing that India did, in fact, once COVID began, was that it stopped investment into Indian companies by Chinese companies. The bans came much later, almost 4 or 5 months later. And the idea behind that was that because of COVID, Indian companies' valuations would have gone down. And so they didn't want acquisitions and investments coming in at that time when valuations were low. But also, India was a battleground between American companies and Chinese companies. Tencent, Alibaba were major investors in the Indian market. And that ban on Chinese apps, alongside the ban on Chinese investment, actually forced many Indian companies to go to the capital markets to do an IPO to raise money. And as an outcome of that, there are about 8 or 10 Indian companies that are listed in the stock markets ever since the ban on investment came in. And many of them have gone out to say that it was because we needed the money that we decided to do an IPO. So in a sense, where those companies might have been acquired by someone else or they might have continued to raise funding for a while, these companies listed as an outcome of the ban on Chinese investment. But the ban on apps was a political move. It was a security move, it was a political move, and the idea of Indian companies being owned by Chinese companies or potentially being bought out was something that was not palatable to the Indian government and to the Indian people at that point in time. But what the ban did was, especially the ban on TikTok, was that about 8 or 9 new short video apps came up because TikTok had 120 million internet users in India. Some say it was 200 million. And India was the largest user base for TikTok outside of China. And as a result of that, there was a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for someone to raise money and to capture that video space. Now, it's another story that that video space was captured by YouTube and Instagram, because YouTube rolled out Shorts almost within 2 months. Instagram also rolled out Reels within 2 months, largely to target the Indian market. So that goal of sovereignty through the ban on TikTok wasn't met because effectively that space was taken up by YouTube and Instagram. So about a week, 2 weeks ago, an Indian app shut down. It was called Koo. It was a clone of Twitter, and the idea behind Koo was that just like India's banned TikTok, will India ban Koo to enforce sovereignty? Will it ban Twitter because Twitter was not complying with Indian law at that point in time, or that was the assertion? As a result of that, Koo got funding, it scaled, but it really had nothing new outside of Twitter. So Twitter's still around, Koo has run out of money, but there is a call after that saying, why doesn't India have its own Google? Why doesn't it have its own Instagram? Why doesn't it have its own WhatsApp? Why doesn't it have its own Facebook? It had its own Twitter, which failed. Now, the problem with this thought process is that we tend to think about companies from the perspective of copying other markets and building our own, and that works in markets where language is an advantage. So in Corrêa, a Kakao Talk might work where WhatsApp may not work. In Japan, Line might work, but in India, English is the main language for the educated class. And so there is no real comparative advantage that an Indian app has, even if it has Indian languages, because even if we have to type in Hindi, quite often we use English text instead of typing in English in Indian script, in Hindi script. So the other thing is that founders in countries like ours are still going through a process of transition and growth. So you have a situation, like if you look at Silicon Valley, they're about 40 years of funding cycles ahead of us. Investments in startups began much earlier. It's a much more mature ecosystem, and India is still going through that process. So Indian founders, have been pushing recently for more sovereignty, for more of a focus on building out, or being supportive of the Indian startup ecosystem by attacking foreign players in the market. But the fact is there are Indian companies that have also succeeded. Uber has a major competitor, in fact, a larger competitor in India called Ola. We have Zomato, which is a food delivery service, which beat out Uber Eats and Food Panda, which were trying to capture the market in India. Naukri is India's largest job website. It beat out Monster when Monster was huge globally. And so it's not that you can't have your own successes, it's just that we almost always end up focusing on failures and using that as an assertion to say, let's have digital sovereignty because we don't have a Google, we don't have a Facebook, and we don't have an Instagram or WhatsApp. Whereas the fact is we have one in other areas where we might not have one in these. And the internet is largely a winner-takes-all market. I'm going to talk a little bit about digital public infrastructure. And I remember a conversation in 2016 at a EU-India Track 1.5 dialogue where someone from the Indian side said, what will happen if Trump decides to shut off MasterCard and Visa? Our economy will collapse, right? And so, in a sense, India has China envy because China rolled out Union Pay many, many years ago. We tried to roll out a RuPay to compete with MasterCard and Visa, and we couldn't. It is that thinking that led us to experiment with UPI. And some of the unilateral actions, for example, that were taken against Russia in the Ukraine war of shutting down SWIFT, of payments, actually reinforced that need to maintain independence and sovereignty for our payments infrastructure. The UPI success that we all talk about has happened because of that need to have an independent payment system. We're talking about digital public infrastructure today because an interoperable global deployment of payments that are not dependent on SWIFT or a certain bank consortium that is largely driven by the West, but is almost like an interchange mechanism that happens independent through a protocol is something which is more palatable to the work that really can't depend on the whims of the West or their political leanings for the growth of our economies. And so you're going to see bit by bit more and more countries look at sovereignty as a mechanism to retain independence. The problem comes when founders start doing this. So we have had instances of Indian startup founders pushing for sovereignty, pushing against foreign companies, saying that this is digital colonization. And you know, colonization is a touchy topic in India, just like it is in Brazil. But pushing against the idea of digital colonization, but at the end of it, what they want is advantage for their own companies. I'll give you an example. Someone who's been talking a lot about digital sovereignty in the last 2 months in India, repeatedly, is a guy called Bhavesh Agarwal. He's the founder of Ola, which is India's Uber. He's rolled out Ola Maps, which are like OpenStreet, which is a layer of OpenStreet maps that they've deployed. They've rolled out a separate cloud service. And so, for example, when the Microsoft situation happened, they said we should have services on our own clouds. They're offering Ola Maps as competition to Google Maps now, and constantly pushing this narrative of sovereignty. Bhavesh in 2015 put out a call against capital dumping by foreign companies because he was competing with Uber. And the thought process there was, Uber has more money than Ola does, and therefore we must restrict this so-called capital dumping. Now the fact is, Ola raised money, foreign capital, to compete against another local ride-hailing service called Taxi for Shore. And Taxi for Shore lost that battle because Ola discounted their services more. Now Uber was doing the same thing to Ola, trying to grab market share. It's a competitive market. But you're using this digital sovereignty narrative to meet your own personal company goals. And we're seeing founders do this a lot now in India. There's another company called Map My India, which has its own maps. They've been pushing against Google Maps. And so a lot of this, I think there is a need for us to separate sovereignty concerns from competition concerns. We shouldn't let the usage of the sovereignty approach we shouldn't let the idea of digital sovereignty be used by companies to benefit themselves. Competition is a completely different game. Sovereignty is different. So if it is about rolling out a payments infrastructure, I welcome that idea, because otherwise your economy collapses. It's a national security concern. It's a global economy concern across the world to be dependent on one player. We don't have independent bodies like we have for the internet that are controlling access to the internet. For example, we don't have that in payments anymore. So interconnection of digital public infrastructure across the world is a good goal to have. And I think India furthering the idea of sovereignty and interconnection and the leadership that we've taken there is useful. But we should not confuse this with competition. And in every country, I expect that there are founders that go and push for this because they benefit from that. Ku was looking to benefit from Twitter getting banned. Multiple small apps were looking to benefit from TikTok getting banned. There is a push for regulation against by Ola against some of the global players because they want to benefit from that. So digital sovereignty shouldn't be a tool for profit making, is the way I look at it. That doesn't benefit consumers. The last thing that I wanted to also point out was that we do have a situation in terms of dominance in the market from a competition perspective with app stores. And when Google was looking to charge 30% commission, all the Indian founders came together and petitioned the government, went to the Competition Commission, and won the case against Google. Monopolistic behavior being addressed is great, but that also became a digital sovereignty narrative, and that digital sovereignty narrative is continuing even today. And we need to be very careful not to mix competition and sovereignty, and that's the core idea that I wanted to leave you with, that leave sovereignty separate and treat competition separately. Thank you.
Thank you very much for describing the situation in India with regard to digital economic sovereignty, but also providing some neat divide. I think this is increasingly blurring. So in India, as well as in Brazil, there is now a proposal of ex-ante regulation of digital platforms that goes beyond competition, and some of the principles include economic sovereignty. So it's a challenge how this will be coordinated with competition. Maybe your suggestion is that it should be two different type of competencies, two different agencies that oversee this, and I think it makes sense. It connects with what was said before about subsidiarity to some extent, because certain services you have the market that can take care, and in some certain other services maybe you want.
There is one point I forgot to make, Nicolo, in fact. When it comes to digital public infrastructure, one of the ideas was to also ensure that you have infrastructure that remains independent of global players. And therefore, to break the UPI was created to break the monopoly of MasterCard and Visa, like I said. But what you've ended up with also is that while UPI is also a private entity, it's a monopoly by a company called NPCI. But on top of NPCI, there are two players that have become a duopoly as well. One is Google with Google Pay, and the other is PhonePe, which is owned by Walmart. So if you wanted to break the monopoly of foreign companies in MasterCard and Visa, that duopoly, you are now left with the duopoly of Google and Walmart as well. So I think breaking foreign monopolies by using digital public infrastructure is not the right way of approaching it, simply because market forces in the internet are such that there will always be consolidation of the market, and those with the deepest pockets will win. And so you'll replace one set of duopolies with another set of duopolies, and that's something we also have to be careful about.
Yes, which in the end connects to what I was saying at the beginning, that sometimes you claim sovereignty to basically the state impose something on the citizen that they might not really want if the prices are going to be inflated, or in the case of, for example, the payment DPI, that their security requirements are relaxed in comparison to the international players. And then this is exported to other countries, like Chile, for example, that is using the concept of DPI from India. So it creates an international puzzle. So I think this was a very interesting set of presentations. You have an opportunity. We are about at time, but we started 10 minutes late, so we have time for a couple of questions. Please raise your hand and direct it to anybody specific, or otherwise say it's for everybody. One here.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. Professor Nico, about...
I'm not a professor.
Okay, so Nico, about the extent of liability between companies when we have... I just want to know your view on this. For example, now we had a problem with the Microsoft actualization. It was crowd stiff today. And Microsoft was impacted. They probably didn't talk before doing this update. And now the whole world has a problem. Nobody's flying. So how do you guys see? It's a question for all. And to Professor Ma, especially, I saw you talked about Gen AI. Can we have, or what do we do in China? Do we have some kind of footprint on this content produced to identify? I know Instagram does some kind of identification, but not properly. They count on, we are telling we are using Gen AI, and I would very much like to hear more from you on this perspective. Thank you very much, Professor Nico.
So very quickly, I think Microsoft is probably going to claim force majeure over here. And as a consequence of that, because they'll say that they were not, they had no involvement in this, and that's what they're trying to pass the blame on to CrowdStrike. But the fact is, whoever installed this update and Microsoft pushes you to do automated updates is effectively a Microsoft customer. And so in my opinion, the liability should be with Microsoft for this, because they pushed an untested update, and CrowdTangle is their partner or vendor. And so unless they have a liability agreement between them, it's Microsoft's responsibility here.
Thank you so much. I think it's a truly interesting question, actually. Yeah, I think what China actually released a new regulation exactly for how to identify whether a content is generated by the generative AI. So normally, the Chinese regulators said that a content generated by AI should be marked by the watermarks, meaning that you generate a content, then on your page there should be a watermark. So saying that this content is I use a machine, so it's not humanly produced. But there is one exception, meaning that for the state-owned media, like People's Daily, like the Xinhua News Agency, so these are the state-backed news agency. In their case, they do use the generative AI for generating certain contents, but they have a very huge propaganda responsibility. So in that case, they cannot totally leave the machine do the thing. So they use the machine, but they don't mark it. So in this case, there can be some difficulties.
Thank you. There is a question from the floor. So I will first go to the floor, then come back here. Over there.
Hi, I'm just thinking about the argument of trading one duopoly for the other, and playing devil's advocate here, wouldn't there be an argument for it to be better to trade the US's duopoly for our own duopoly? I mean, China has been working on endogenous innovation for the last 20 years, and they've created internet giants, which are giants, but they are Chinese, and then they generate high-paying jobs in China. They generate R&D efforts which are located in China and not patented elsewhere, and do not export most of the values to the US and other European countries and etc. So isn't there an argument for actually exchanging the duopoly from outside to inside?
Thank you, Walter, for the provocative question. There's a question over there as well.
It's just because I also provoked by Nikhil's intervention, and perhaps it dialogues with your question. I can also see value, perhaps, in changing the duopoly geopolitically, but I also think that I wanted to hear from the panel, because the question that provoked me on Nikhil's intervention was thinking about iFood in Brazil, which is a Brazilian app company with terrible labor practices. So is it better? Or what are the recommendations or guidelines or concepts or so on that we should put in place when we think about digital sovereignty? And that's why I was talking about collective self-determination earlier, because I think it's more community, democratic, popular concept that maybe doesn't exist in sovereignty as it happens with collective self-determination. But how do we avoid that the concept is captured by big entrenched powers just for their own benefit? How do we coordinate this with important democratic, participative, and human rights-based concerns?
Right, and that's to all, right? Okay, last question. Right.
Thank you. I've heard a lot of you guys talking about how digital sovereignty is related to autonomy and related to the individual power of choice and having alternatives and everything. But have you guys considered that none of these initiatives that we are talking about today consider a data ownership right? Because with that kind of right, we could target all of those issues in a way that none of, how can I say, the big, if you have the power to choose, if you have the power to take out the data and do whatever you want with it, you will be protected from the big techs, you will be protected from big regulators. I would like a comment of everyone who would like it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great set of questions. So where do we start? I think, Nikki, there was a couple towards you. As you wish.
Yeah. I want to react to Walter's question, which is a very interesting question, actually. Yeah, well, about the duopoly, maybe between the USA and China, or if I can imagine in this way. Yeah, I think for the values produced within China, yes, but you see, for today, the AI is a very geopoliticized thing, actually. So it's not only about technology, it's not only about the science, it's not only about economics, it's also about the security of a country, about your opportunity to survive in the geopolitical competition. So for China, there is not only the internal problems, but there is also this very imminent kind of geopolitical pressure. So India, I don't criticize you, but India, Japan, or South Korea. So well, I would like to see the geopolitical position for China in Pacific Asia is not very favorable. So in a sense, so each country, for the BRICS, for instance, so I think today one of the problems which prevent these countries from collaborating closely is actually this need to defend their own interest. So there is the duopoly, of course, but yeah, we should find some solutions, for instance, in the framework of G20 to find some cooperation mechanism. But at this moment, it's true that there is kind of a very selfish, egoistic approach to the AI.
I just wanted to address the duopoly question again. So if you think about it, what I said was a duopoly of MasterCard and Visa has been replaced with a duopoly of Google and Walmart. None of those companies are Indian. The problem really is you're not allowing competition to take shape in the market. There are Indian companies that have defeated foreign competitors because they have provided better products, better services at a better cost. Ola, like the one who's asking for sovereignty, actually beat Uber in the Indian market. Zomato food delivery beat Uber Eats and Food Panda. Naukri.com defeated Monster. So I would rather that the companies in my country face global competition and defeat them, rather than creating a framework where substandard services, because like I said, many TikTok clones came and they died. I don't want substandard services. Why should I as a consumer suffer because of that? AI is a different issue because one of the things that every country is going to face is because all the large language models are mostly foreign to them, in the sense they're either US based or they're China based. The cost of building AI products on top of that software is going to lead to foreign exchequer going out. I'm having to pay $20 a month to OpenAI to take their API, right? I'm building an AI business myself, so I know that having cheaper local large language models benefits me, and it creates a level playing field with India-specific pricing. Now, if they would, what's happened is, in competition with Ola Maps, like I mentioned, Google 2 days ago announced a lowering of Maps API costs in India. So competition is great, Let there be more players, let there be competition, let the best product win. That's how consumers benefit. Just on the data ownership piece, I honestly don't know any person who's been able to benefit from taking their data out and putting it somewhere else or using it. So it's something that we all talk about, that it's great to own our own data. But also remember, data is co-created with the service that you've used, number one. And two, if it's not used in conjunction with the service, there is no benefit from it. So ownership of data doesn't really matter. What will you do? Just take a dump of 20 GB and put it somewhere and never see it again? What's the benefit in that?
Yeah, we could discuss this for a long time, but let me also hear some answers from this side, maybe starting from Marina.
So very quickly about the last question, because I think it's very interesting, the question. And I think when we are thinking about disinformation and our data collected by big techs, of course, the big case that came to my mind is Cambridge Analytica. Everyone knows about it, and it was a very important case in which we saw the power of big techs and these companies when they have our data and how they can shape one election or one result and everything like that. But when we are talking about disinformation, it usually spreads through different medias, through different platforms. Usually we saw the same content on Instagram, on Facebook, on WhatsApp, and in texting apps like WhatsApp, that is very popular in Brazil, we don't have that it's not, it's more about sending messages to family, to friends, so it's not really, not necessarily related to to a big tech collecting our data. So I think it's important to see the different aspects of the misinformation subject. Thank you for the question and all the others.
Thanks. Just also a quick remark that probably puts together some of the ideas that I've heard during the very interesting question is that, like, probably everybody has mentioned one topic that ranks at the top of what they think of what we think should be the aim of this discussion of sovereignty, whether it is a competitive market, whether it is the protection of data rights, or whether we should have, like Veridiana said, like more a collective perspective on that area, and that probably leads to thinking that no single goal might address completely the issue. From my perspective, and probably this is influenced because I'm a competition law head, competitive markets, it is a must, and we should take that into account when thinking about whether sovereignty has been reached. Okay, it might have been reached in a way in that we can see a state making its own decisions and having their own infrastructure, but that might not be enough because we still need to have that power being checked by competitive forces or by other sort of accountability for achieving the goal of having data subjects, communities, or consumers, as we may want to see it, like developing and taking benefits of these digital services.
Wait, just the last intervention.
So just
very
one
much
moment.
agreed.
I think data ownership would improve digital sovereignty for the individual, but I think also we need to understand autonomy not only regarding the control of the data, but still regarding the consequences of this data process. So we were talking about here before about regulating Uber drivers, and then Professor Ma brought cars, driverless cars. So I get a little bit concerned about it. And then I had a question for you about this, taking a look into the future, but I'll keep it for the backstage. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that we have a lot of food for thought. The discussion will continue. The topic of DPI has already been flagged as an important component of this. But one point that I think is common to here is that we need more transparency, not only transparency as a mean of giving sovereignty over algorithmic practices and competition in the market, but also about the proper use of sovereignty by states when they claim that something is done for that purpose. So thank you very much for your attention. Please thank the speakers as well. Thank you. Start in 15 minutes, no? Oh, immediately, okay.
We're just having a 1-minute intermission here. But if the speakers for the next panel could come up, please. Okay, everyone. Thank you for hanging around for our final discussion of the day. I think the last panel has led very nicely to, we've already had some mentions of digital public infrastructure in the last session. We have 4 great speakers to talk about this from the perspective of different countries. I'll just briefly introduce them and get to it because I think we have 1 hour, maybe a little bit of space, but if I could ask our speakers to stick to 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll have time for some questions from the audience. So first of all, on my far right is Armando Manzueta, who is Director of Digital Transformation of the Dominican Republic. Very, very interested to hear, from someone who is actually putting this into practice on a large scale. We have Alexandre Costa, who is a researcher at the CyberBricks project here at FGV. We also have Jai Vipra, similarly a researcher at CyberBricks. Unfortunately, Hannah Draper from Consumers International is ill today, so can't join us, but thank you so much to Maria Luciano, who is a lead research analyst on digital public infrastructures from EDEC, correct? Great, so Armando, over to you.
Buenas tardes a todos, gracias de nuevo por estar aquí presente. Bien, y siguiendo la conversación que hemos estado teniendo en estos últimos días sobre todo este tema de infraestructura pública digital, realmente las infraestructuras públicas digitales como tal nos permiten a nosotros, hasta cierto punto, no solamente crear y digitalizar servicios públicos de siguiente generación en escala, sino que es una oportunidad para también generar espacios de soberanía en los países donde estas se implementan. Naturalmente, tenemos varias oportunidades acá, porque las infraestructuras como tal también pueden irse en 2 vías. Podemos perfectamente tercerizar las mismas y que estas, en cualquiera de los 3 ámbitos donde usualmente se definen, puedan ser gestionadas directamente por un operador privado que en nombre del gobierno pues efectúe cualquier operación para la prestación de estos servicios, ya sea en temas de pagos, donde mayormente se ve esto, pero también en temas de servicios de identidad y en servicios de interoperabilidad. Aunque naturalmente eso va con una serie de acuerdos legales y demás. La ventaja es que, digamos que de este approach es que el gobierno hasta cierto punto se descarga de una gran responsabilidad en cuanto a la implementación de estas soluciones, pero también corre el riesgo de que tenga que depender obligatoriamente de un proveedor específico para poder prestar este servicio número uno, y también, para el caso de que necesite hacer cambios a la misma infraestructura, pues tenga que también recurrir a él para efectuar esos cambios, y eso tiene un costo, y ese costo va a ir creciendo a la medida que más usuarios van haciendo uso de estas plataformas. Por el otro lado, si nos volcamos, por ejemplo, a la implementación de DPIs, que más allá de DPIs sean también bienes públicos digitales o sean soluciones que propiamente sean vinculadas a proyectos open source o que sean de naturaleza abierta o que hayan sido desarrollados internamente por parte de los mismos estados, digamos que ahí es donde existe la oportunidad de comenzar a generar esta soberanía, ya que estamos rompiendo las cadenas que nos vinculan a todo este proceso de atar un servicio a un proveedor privado. Hasta cierto punto ayuda también a generar capacidades internas dentro del mismo gobierno para que estos servicios puedan seguir desarrollándose internamente y a su vez ir mejorando en el tiempo. Sin embargo, también trae consigo varios riesgos, y este riesgo va atado al tema de algo que sufrimos en todo el mundo, principalmente en pequeños estados como el caso de la República Dominicana, que es el tema del talento. Porque construir una plataforma que soporte toda la infraestructura de un gobierno y que muchas veces cruce esa frontera y también sirva para alimentar servicios del lado del sector privado, amerita una serie de personas que tengan un conocimiento profundo en materia de arquitectura, en materia de diseño de sistemas, que aparte de eso también entienda las peculiaridades legales, ¿verdad?, que hay que tener en cuenta al momento de diseñarlo, por temas de privacidad, por un tema de seguridad, también de que no se vaya a hacer ninguna operación ilegal, etcétera. Ahora bien, digamos que en ese sentido, queda ya opción de cada país determinar cuál modelo debe de seguir, aunque cada día más estamos viendo la tendencia hacia un modelo que vaya orientado a la soberanía, ya sea por construcción propia o incluso por un esquema de federación entre un grupo de países que se puedan consorciar para poder salir adelante con esto. Ahí ya digamos que hay un camino recorrido, porque por parte de Naciones Unidas, junto con otros actores, ya se creó un espacio, que es la Alianza por Bienes Públicos Digitales, que es un consorcio de varias organizaciones, pública-privada, que hasta cierto punto están identificando soluciones que ahora mismo pudieran ser potenciales infraestructuras públicas digitales que pudieran ser aprovechadas por los países, y que estas plataformas sirvan como base para poder construir esos DPIs, tanto a nivel fundacional como a nivel sectorial. Al margen de eso, también digamos que hay otras iniciativas, como el caso de la iniciativa GovStack, que está dentro del sistema de Naciones Unidas, que en este caso la lidera la Unión Internacional de Telecomunicaciones, que define una serie de patrones de arquitectura de plataformas, tanto a nivel de DPIs como a nivel de bienes públicos digitales, precisamente para que los países ya tengan ese modelo de referencia y puedan a partir de ahí desarrollar las cosas que necesitan. Asimismo también, y esa es otra tercera alternativa, es que organizaciones como Codivelop y junto con otras más han también impulsado lo que es el Centro de Infraestructura Pública Digital, que es algo que surge también en India y que también, digamos, ofrece asistencia técnica a los países para diseñar esos DPIs. Ya de por sí tiene una cantidad bastante apreciable de modelos de referencia de arquitectura, de cómo estos DPIs deberían construirse, en adición a una serie de recomendaciones tecnológicas para su desarrollo y su posterior implementación, y que hasta cierto punto pudieran ayudar a seguir avanzando hacia ese cambio de la soberanía. Entonces, viendo este escenario y entendiendo la importancia sistémica que tiene todo el tema de construcción de estas plataformas y los mecanismos que hay varias cuestiones que quedan sobre la mesa. Número uno, quién la desarrolla y cómo se desarrolla. Número dos, cómo se financia. Y número tres, cuáles son los estándares que va a garantizar de que estas plataformas, estas infraestructuras, sean interoperables entre sí, no solamente a nivel nacional, pero también a nivel internacional. Y también con eso le suman otros factores que ya se han discutido antes, como el tema de protección de datos y la ciberseguridad. Entonces, esas son las cosas que ahora mismo estamos, como quien dice, tratando de discutir. En adición a otra serie de reglas y salvaguardas que se tienen que definir para que estas plataformas puedan cumplir con su objetivo de generar inclusión, de generar espacios de crecimiento y oportunidades económicas y para todas, y más allá que permitan el alcance de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible en el tiempo.
Thanks, Amanda. Really interesting hearing about the international cooperation. I wonder if that's something we can come back to. And I thought you were saying just at the end there, interesting as well, these tools give states the opportunity to prioritize values like inclusion, which perhaps are not the private sector's first interest. Great. So our second speaker, Alex.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to greet my fellow colleagues from CTS. It was a good time when I spent here. João, Giovanni, colleagues and transcriptors and translators and so on. It's a pleasure to share this session as well with Zai, the colleagues, Ian, Armando as well. And following this discussion today, I was reflecting, I mean, at the same time that we've heard that people or states or communities are afraid of technology. I think we're also somehow afraid of states in some really high level. I think we need to develop the mechanisms. It was also discussed here to make how we can make these states accountable and indeed democratic and so on. But we cannot deny that states are playing again the role after the 30 years of austerity policies that we saw since the 90s. I mean, geopolitics is changing. States are back in the game. And I'm happy to explore here these interdependencies as well of digital public infrastructures and digital sovereignty, starting, as I said, that we are mostly referring to this proactive role of states in shaping these digital infrastructures and technologies. Also considering the role of states in funding these infrastructures, in regulating these infrastructures, and how they are doing that. And I also appreciated how Armando said that indeed this design choices, and was also emphasized by Ian, has also social and policy implications. And I think there's an interesting opportunity in terms of G20 to come up with some consensus around how this design principles can be materialized within technology infrastructures. But in the very essence, digital sovereignty has to do with control, among other things, of these digital infrastructures, and at least how I perceive it in a specific scholarship, that infrastructure also has this tangible dimension, this physical dimension necessarily. Sometimes we try to talk about protocols, standards, and we often miss, I don't know if the sound is good, but often miss the tangible material aspects where this data is hosted, and so on. So, and when we talk about infrastructure, also as Armando said, we talk about something big, layered, and complex, right? And I appreciate that you brought this digital public goods on the table as well, because exactly these layers, these blocks, or these components that when together come up and as an infrastructure, they can also be perceived as a public good, depending on the also design choices. And especially how the United Nations, the Secretary General, defined digital public goods as being open standards, open AI models, open data, open content, and open protocols to foster the SDGs. But focusing now in the Brazilian scenario, Brazil has been very widely shared example of DPIs precisely because of PIX as a payment method, and also as GovBR and now the National Identity Card and also the data sharing protocols within the government. And when we can discuss each one of them, I don't think that's the point within our time frame here, but I'd like to emphasize that there are many other initiatives that can also be perceived as a DPI, even though the G20 came up with sort of a consensus, sort of an agreement that it would restrict to these three main ones: digital ID, payment methods, and data sharing, data interoperability frameworks. But we can also think of, for instance, the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation in Salvador that developed the CDAX, which is a data sharing framework and hosting for healthcare policies development. Cadastro Único is a single registry for information, social information systems that has been used for several social protection policies, especially Bolsa Família. CAR, the territorial registry for land management in such a vast, huge area that Brazil has, for example. So all of them can be perceived as digital public infrastructure. But I also like to recap what Lucas said, that Brazil pioneered this non-SAD approach to digital sovereignty since its policies on open source software in the early 2000s, and which was also followed by other Latin American countries. And what is often missed, this policy got interrupted exactly when a coup d'etat took place in Brazil in 2016. So that's something that must also be on the table. And right after this process started a really huge and fast accelerated digitization of public services that one way or another, with all these contradictions, led us to become a huge reference also in digital identification. We've been discussing this at least since 2018, 2019, in the framework that now it's embedded within this DPI framework. We also wrote a report called Good ID in Latin America, launched in 2019, that I also welcome you to take a look on that. Just finishing, going to some reflections for the G20 itself. But just before, I'd like to emphasize this material aspect of cloud infrastructure, because the Brazilian data processor state company, Serpro, one of those at the federal level. Brazil has many state companies dealing with data processing, especially two at the federal level, Serpro and DataPrev. They have been really resisting for a strong process for being privatized in the past 4 years, and they managed to consolidate themselves. And Serpro last year launched what they call the government cloud, Nuvem de Governo, and it's being implemented. But even though data is being hosted within governmental databases, those in charge of customizing, providing consulting, providing training, or Amazon, Google, or Huawei. So the extent to which we are sovereignty is not an end in itself. It's kind of a process that sometimes we hear today that, oh, we cannot be there. No, it's a process of developing these autonomies, of developing also this, in practice, self-determination. And regarding what myself I'd like to see in the G20 declarations, as we saw in New Delhi's one last year, and also, as Armando said, we must have more discussions about how DPIs are really being developed, conceived, and maintained in different contexts. I'm happy that the UN DPI safeguards are developing this pilot project. I also like to hear the subsidiarity principle, like really thinking G20 could state something related to multi-level governance of the commons. Like, if you think of infrastructure at the local level, are we referring like bike or ride sharing as infrastructures? Are we referring to social protection, healthcare, education as a national level as DPI as well? Are we considering even social media as a global and search engines as infrastructures, as at least even some internet pioneers at the Institute of DPI within the Massachusetts Amherst University also placed DPI as social media. And the G20 could also think of developing DPIs for the G20 decisions, right? If you are coming up with an agreement of taxing the super rich, there will be a meeting next week here in Rio. And how can we really enable this tax fulfillment, this tax payment channels? That could be a specific DPI for G20, even for climate agreements. Just as an example, the French government, the central bank, is developing an inventory of carbon footprint emissions within the central bank itself to think of exploiting this for environmental, social, and governance assets in the near future. Is it a DPI as well? How can we share this among the other G20 countries? Just to illustrate how I envision what could be an ideal agreement in terms of G20. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. Some really interesting broader ideas there about how the concept of DPI might develop. As you say, Brazil and other countries in the region have really been leading on some of these tools, and I think the EU is just sort of really going for a digital wallet program. So I'm very interested to see what they might learn from Brazil and other G20 countries' experience. Thank you for that. Next we have Jai.
Thank you, Ian. Hi, everyone. It's really hard to say anything substantial or important on the third day of a conference after everyone has spoken so much, but I will try. Nikhil has already talked about the specificities of the political economy of DPI in India. So I'll take a sort of more bird's eye view and talk about DPI as a concept and what it is capable of doing. The main point I want to make today is that independence is a necessary condition for sovereignty, but it is not a sufficient condition for sovereignty. And I really liked what Ale said about sovereignty being a process. And so just in the spirit of independence being a necessary condition, I think we saw the Microsoft outage today. And it's very evident that if something like this can happen accidentally, it can also be done deliberately. And so if there is one country that controls much of the world's digital infrastructure, you can imagine that if they wanted to, they could shut it down, right? So, and even if, no country, oh, is it soft? Oh, sorry. Hello, is this better? Okay. So even if a country doesn't want to deliberately shut your operations down, the fact that it has happened accidentally and no one is compensating you for all the flights missed, all the hospitals that are not working, means that you are not in fact digitally sovereign when a foreign company is able to do this through its negligence and you are not able to hold it accountable. I've been talking a lot about hardware controls and how you need to have your own hardware to actually enable any sort of independence in what you do digitally in your country also. Don't forget that the Snowden revelations showed us that there were backdoors and Cisco equipment that were shipped overseas and that were used. So when you think about digital sovereignty, you do also have to think about hardware. And DPIs can help you achieve this independence. But I think, again, the outage today has showed us that we need to think beyond even digital independence and think about how independence might mean not networking everything, resisting the temptation to digitalize everything also. You don't need your home to be a smart home. This is not necessary because it really opens you up to so many vulnerabilities that are outside your control, that are outside your government's control even. So I think we can take a step back and talk about that. And Nikhil talked about how you need to separate sovereignty and competition, but there are, of course, overlaps where, you know, if there is a company that is so big and if digital markets always tend towards consolidation, then antitrust law can also allow you not just to break companies up, but also to treat companies as systemically important. And if they are systemically important, they have higher liabilities, you know, they have to have higher sort of safety measures that they have to take, security measures, so that things that happened last night don't happen again, you know. So there is some kind of overlap between the two for sure. Second, that independence is not a sufficient condition. So of course, like you've seen, there are forces that pull DPI in an undesirable direction. It often tends towards the promotion of large domestic capital, not even small domestic capital. So there is a difference between the two. So you're not always promoting the interests of people who sell products on Amazon. You're promoting the interests of other platforms who would like to compete with Amazon. So you have to be careful about whose interests are being promoted. And we should always remember that governments like it when markets are concentrated because it makes surveillance easy for them, right? So Max Schrems, I think, has talked about this before, where NSA surveillance occurs through data centers. So it's very useful that there are only a handful of companies that have these large data centers. So you can just, instead of spying on every phone, you can spy on data centers. So governments love it when markets are concentrated, and monopolists love it when governments increase or maintain barriers to entry for competitors, because of course, you know, it helps them protect their market share. So governments don't stop rampant data collection by the monopolist, but they will stop data sharing when they say it's about data protection. You cannot share this data. So there is a very lovely and very convenient nexus that occurs sometimes between governments and monopolists. But therefore, you need actually mass movements and political pressure to actually make sovereignty mean anything. So, and I want to give you an example about this. In India, there were millions of farmers that were protesting against some farm laws that would have consolidated agriculture. A couple of years ago, these laws were already passed, and there were about 1 million farmers camping outside the capital for almost for over a year. And there was an instance where these farmers went ahead and destroyed mobile towers, hundreds of mobile towers that were owned by Reliance, which was seen largely to be wanting to consolidate agricultural markets. So Reliance wanted to consolidate these markets as was perceived by the farmers, and therefore they destroyed mobile towers of Reliance to make a point to say you cannot really do this. And you know, eventually Reliance said, we are not interested in agriculture, we don't even want to do this. The government withdrew the laws, the farmers won. And so the point I want to make is it's not always about civil society movements or digital rights movements, although, you know, in the rare cases that they are successful, they are. For instance, the movement for net neutrality was quite successful, although it was really narrow. But it is a question of, to achieve real sovereignty, you need actually mass political movements that are about other issues, but that incorporate what the digital does in those issues and how digital infrastructure is implicated in those issues. And so after you have this sort of political, or while you have this sort of political understanding and mass political movements, I think, is when you can have inclusive DPI like in the Dominican Republic, or that's when you can decide to build DPI where it is appropriate, and once you've built it, to hold it accountable and also to change it when required. Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. I think some really important issues there that link also to what Ali was saying about your example of cloud, of local cloud. This is exactly what also happened in the EU. Local cloud, designed, built, operated, consulted, trained by the US giants. And actually, just listening to you both, I was reminded of if this is a theme people want to follow up on, very interesting book published last year by Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman called Underground Empire, How America Weaponized the World Economy. And we've heard several times through the day about, and it's well known now, I think, how the US has used the dollar, the international reserve currency, and the power that gives the US to sanction. We heard about Russia earlier and in other places, and some of these new data processing systems are analogous to that. That's one of the arguments of that book. And then, so, finally, thank you so much, Maria.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm stepping in for the brilliant Hannah Draper, so I hope I would do her justice, but I promise I'll try. So I was mentioned before, I'm the lead research analyst for DPI at the Brazilian Institute for Consumer Defense. I'm also a facilitator for the C20 working group on digitalization technology and a working member for the UN DPI Safeguards Initiative. So basically a overdose of DPI in the past few months. But I really appreciate the introduction and the segue to discussing power, because I feel like when we're talking about sovereignty, that's definitely a main point to discuss power imbalancing. And I also feel like in terms of language, language plays a major role when we're discussing power and power imbalances. It was brought up earlier about the definitions of DPI. I mean, we do have some consensus around G20, but we also have a G7 definition, which also differs in terms of the objectives of a DPI, whether or not it's supposed to support access to private services as well as public ones. They also differ in terms of how they address the proposition that DPI should be open. So G7 doesn't mention that DPI should be open, and G20 does mention it, but it also opens the possibility of proprietary technology and a mix of both. So again, it is interesting to see how this different actors and different political interest and economical interest play in defining those supposedly consensus definitions. And I also feel like language also plays a role in annihilating people, keeping people away from the conversation. So when we frame conversations about tech around expressions like artificial intelligence, which doesn't really mean much in terms of what does the technology does, or when we use expressions like DPI, digital public infrastructures, what does that mean? It's one thing to tell people about DPI, it's another thing to talk to them about PICs, about gov.br, about connected SUS. Those systems are well known and are used and are experienced lively every day. So yeah, this is our main concern about coming up with those type of conversations, defining the language, defining the definitions. Even at the UN initiative, we're also more inclined to use the G20 definition, but is that the ideal one? Again, we're still struggling with that, and they also play a part in what type of systems and what type of power that we want to have over the systems that are affecting vulnerable communities majorly. In the context of PICs, as a member of the PICs Forum myself, the governance body of the Brazilian Central Bank, it's also interesting, again, in terms of language, when we're talking within the PICs Forum, the word participants comes out a lot, but when they talk about participants, they're talking about the banks that are working within the PIC systems. They are not talking about consumers. They are not talking about end users. Actually, IDEC is the only organization representing consumers within the PICs Forum. And even as member of the PICs Forum, we still don't know much about it. So we're still trying to figure out how exist within it and how to work within it and try to contribute the best as we can. And I just also in terms of language, I would like to highlight that I'm using the word consumer here in a broader sense. Again, when we're talking about data and technology, is not that two-end relationship of consumer and the person selling the technology. We do know that data from others also impacted us, impacted pricing of services, impact how public services and public policies are designed and implemented. So when we're talking about consumers, we're talking in a larger common interest and public goods sense. And another topic, again, around the definition of DPI, it's what does the public in DPI means, or at least what it should mean. And again, it also relates to the conversations about open standards, about governance. So it's really interesting. It was mentioned here before about coloniality and how continue to use global north-centric technologies is a continuation of that type of exploration. Even populations from the global south being used to train algorithms. It's something that we do know that is happening, or even like in Bolivia, Elon Musk being behind a group of a coup because of lithium for its company's productions. So it is that question of realizing and acknowledging, trying to address how political context and disputes can affect the technology and the services, and mostly the people that those services are aiming to provide, which also relates to the problem of funding. I mean, we do know that the World Bank for years now have been funding digital ID systems, and a lot of those systems that it is funded have, reportedly caused harm to populations. In many of the conversations and the concerns raised by civil society haven't been addressed by those experiences, by the central bank. So again, a matter of, it's interesting to realize how the DPI seems to be a global south movement led, but the conversation and the funding is coming from the global north. So what's really happening there, what's the interest behind, and what kind of dynamic are we trying to push here, and what type of dynamic do we want in consolidating those systems? And another issue that I'd like to raise is about participation and participatory governments. As I mentioned, PIX has a participatory body, but it's not very participatory. Gov.br doesn't have one, so we don't have not even information to criticize it. And in India, the UPI, it was majorly criticized by the top-down approach and how it didn't really quite spoke to citizens and users. But we do have successful participatory governance experience regarding technology, regarding data, that we could be looking into and exploring more and using as example. So we have the BBMob app in Araraquara, which is a city in Brazil. So it was created by a cooperative of taxi drivers, and it created a platform to compete with Uber. So it was a platform created, designed, and governed by the drivers to make sure that their earnings are fair, they'd have more security and better working conditions. We have in South Africa the Abolabi initiative, which was, there were apps created to help fishermen communities to make their work better. So it'll help them manage their finance. It will help them to understand better the weather that we're working when fishing, understand better how to sell their fish, and that helped empower the community. And the whole process of conception, design, governance was made by the community and for the community. And in Brazil, we also have the Baobaxia initiative, which is an initiative to preserve and manage cultural productions of indigenous and quilombola communities here in Brazil. So any type of artistic or cultural type of expression, these communities has been preserved in different systems, even in places where they don't have much access to internet. They build a system that could, work around that obstacles. So again, to end on a higher hopeful note, we do have good examples to look into. And to close my my initial presentation, I would like to share a few ideas, suggestions of where to go to from here, drawing a lot from our policy recommendations from the C20 and also the things that I've been hearing at the UN Safeguards Initiative. I think I already mentioned the first one regarding participatory governance, transparency, and accountability. And just to give a few examples of how to address those principles, we have the idea of thinking about law enforcement, even funding, who's paying for all those systems and how that funding arrangement relates to the power dynamics, or even funding for attending in conferences like this, and who are we bringing to the debate, and whether or not we're enable other people to the debate. I think you mentioned about creating political movements, and yeah, that's the idea of including in those more people in the conversation, even funding for conferences that we were in the past 2 days here at PDP Latam, hoping to have more transparent and responsive funding policy for more inclusive participation. We have examples of impact assessments when we're thinking about DPI, and I'm not only talking about after the implementation. I think when we think about a system that big and that important, I'm talking about the scope phase, the design, the conception, the implementation, and the management afterwards. And the impact assessments also can be a mechanism for participation. You could create a process of creating an impact assessment that would bring together different stakeholders, particularly the affected communities of that system. And the same can be said for public procurement. I mean, in Barcelona, we have a great example. They created a public procurement initiative. The idea is the government should only buy technology, and hire companies that are using fair labor practices, they are using fair and concerned environmental practices. So when we're thinking about how we're gonna design and implement, and who are we gonna bring to the DPI governance systems, I think we should have those concerns in mind, and they need to be addressed. Another recommendation concerns inclusion and non-discrimination in guaranteeing human rights, again, throughout the whole life cycle of the DPI, but also in terms of how it affects people. So people who cannot access a specific system. In Brazil, we now have gov.br being demanded for even filing consumer complaints. So if you don't have an account at gov.br, and therefore if you don't give your data to the government, you won't be able to file a complaint as a citizen, as a consumer. So there are not alternative systems or procedures for that. So again, that's not very inclusive. Another point that was also raised here regards capacity building. I mean, it doesn't really work to have a great system if the people who are implementing it and supervising it don't really know what's going on, don't really know the best practices and the rationale behind it. And then again, it also relates a lot with sovereignty. You need to create your own capacity and resources to be able to manage those power imbalances. A point of literacy, and I think, we're talking about digital literacy, obviously because of digital sovereignty, but also when you're talking about PIX in Brazil, a lot of the shortcomings of PIX come from the lack of financial literacy, the lack of digital literacy of people, going to schemes that are inducing them to err because they don't have that type of knowledge to self-determination. And finally, I'd like to stress the topic of meaningful redress. Again, it is important to try to mitigate risk throughout the whole DPI life cycle, but thinking in the end, if something does not work, despite all those safeguards, people need to know where to seek redress, where to seek help, and as you mentioned, when you're going, when flights aren't happening anymore, when things are shutting down, that will impact people's lives, and people should be accounted for it. So yeah, I think those are the major points, and also coming up to the point of redress, we had in Brazil a good bad experience about redress, because during the pandemic we had the emergency aid fund, but a lot of the decisions regarding the aid were automated, and a lot of were unfair, but people didn't have means to contest. It all fall in the lap of the public servants, public defenders, sorry, which already, already have limited resources and limited capacity, and then within all the context of COVID, they had this additional task to deal with. So it is important to keep that in mind. And also, again, I think it is also a call for more opportunities for consumers' perspectives, of effective community perspectives within these conversations. I think I'll stop here, but thank you so much.
Thanks, Maria. Some great concrete examples there about participatory governance with PICs and with other systems, and the importance of literacy. That was something we also heard yesterday. The lack of consumer knowledge about rights they had in regard to things like salary portability, credit portability, lunch voucher portability, and so these weren't being taken up because people didn't know about them. Thanks to the speakers for being concise. So we still have 20 minutes for questions and discussions, which is great. Who would like to go first? We have someone right at the back. And then this gentleman at the front.
Can I make my question in Portuguese?
Yes, please.
Oh, can I? Oh, thank you. Nesse painel eu fiquei muito pensando, enfim, com o evento de hoje, né, com os problemas que a gente teve com a Microsoft. Como entusiasta do software livre, eu fiquei muito pensando na questão do... Se a gente tem uma infraestrutura pública e a gente quer soberania, não adianta também a gente ter empresas privadas dentro dessa estrutura pública e que podem fazer isso de remover, de acontecer alguma coisa, como aconteceu com a Microsoft, ou deles só removerem o produto porque não dá mais lucro, sabe? E aí, enfim, foi um dos pontos. E pensando também na questão de como funcionam as estratégias aqui no Brasil de concessão de espaço para que empresas privadas possam oferecer os seus serviços para órgãos públicos, eu fico pensando que não é, mesmo na questão da Índia, por exemplo, muitas dessas empresas também recebem capital privado de fora para que elas funcionem da forma como funcionam aqui dentro, tais como o iFood, que é muito grande. Deixa eu pensar mais. Enfim, eu só consigo pensar no iFood agora como empresa nacional muito, muito forte, né? E aí me veio na cabeça o caso da Índia, né, com essa bipartidaridade das empresas receberem o capital, fazerem o que fazem, né, de querer pleitar o direito de serem as maiores e tal. E era uma pergunta que eu queria jogar para vocês. Pô. Como fazer com que isso não aconteça, assim, de que a gente deveria, de fato, exigir que essas estruturas sejam 100% feitas ou pelo governo ou pelas pessoas do país, né? Ou não, assim, a gente poderia ter alguma salvaguarda, talvez jurídica, que possa prevenir isso, enfim. Foi só uma pergunta, uma sugestão, enfim, não sei, gente. Obrigada.
Great. Jai, did you get? I wasn't sure if you got that. I think everyone else did. Amanda, do you understand Portuguese? I'm sorry, I should have checked. If I could repeat your final sentence, where you had a very specific question for the panel. What does the public in DPI really mean? How far should limits on private sector involvement, on national design and things? Is that a fair statement of your question? Who would like to address that? Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your question. It is the $1 million question when we're talking about DPI. I like to remain hopeful, and as I mentioned, there are good experiences out there, and I always mention in my lectures the Barcelona case, in which they created a public procurement process in which some of the requirements are about fair labor practice, environmental practice. They are sustainable. So there are some, I like to think there are some safeguards, because there are limited resources when we're talking about, keeping 100% public, but I don't think we should bring in private actors to the table without those type of safeguards, without losing public interest and common goods insight. But also it's interesting, again, I'm very passionate about the discussions regarding language. So even the term DPI, it was created for a whole different thing. It was created, as a position to platforms, to Facebook, to discuss people's rights and opinions and ideas. So the expression was co-opted, and now here we are again talking about private sectors within those arrangements. So it is there is a lot in terms of political disputes of what kind of DPI and what that should mean. So yeah, thank you for your question.
No, y en adición a eso, realmente la concepción de lo que es público realmente va a depender mucho de la naturaleza y la apertura que se tenga en un determinado gobierno sobre eso, porque público puede ser, bien como dijo María, que esté orientado a generar valor público y que sea algo que esté en el interés común de todos los ciudadanos y ciudadanas de un estado determinado. Pero público también puede ser que la propiedad de la infraestructura sea completamente pública y que, en consecuencia, el desarrollo y el mantenimiento de esa infraestructura para poder generar valor público esté completamente dentro del Estado. Hay otros que dirán, bueno, digamos que la titularidad de la plataforma es del Estado, pero la titularidad sobre las operaciones puede recaer sobre un privado. Sin embargo, ese privado debe ceñirse bajo una serie de reglas que el Estado define y que se debe someterse a un proceso de auditoría. Y, naturalmente, como la plataforma y el servicio es del Estado, pues tanto los códigos fuentes como los demás componentes tecnológicos que están sometidos bajo esos criterios que se tienen que definir, también hasta cierto punto están abiertos al escrutinio público. No necesariamente se maneja así en todas partes, pero la idea es que en espacios como el G20, que ahora Brasil tiene la presidencia, hay una oportunidad interesante de poder definir exactamente a qué nos referimos con público. Y naturalmente, más allá, ahora mismo en Naciones Unidas, que está un tema de discusión permanente, digamos que también ahora en la Cumbre del Futuro, en el proceso de cierre de negociaciones del Pacto Digital Global, sobre el cual DPI es uno de los pilares fundamentales de todo esto, digamos que también puede que ya podamos tener una definición más próxima a lo que nosotros entendemos debe ser esto. Así que, pregamos.
Very quickly, and I think I understood your question because my Portuguese also mais ou menos, but I think you are also talking about foreign capital and how, just the involvement of foreign capital is also a problem. And I think, yes, it is a problem because we are often dealing with speculative capital here. And, it works through predatory pricing. So you're always pricing below cost so you can take over that market. And I think there's lots of scope for the law to prevent that, to just say this is not okay because we know what happens. And so far, antitrust has been very conservative on the issue of predatory pricing, but it doesn't have to be. You have to respond to what is, really happening in the world. And the other thing that happens with these platforms like iFood and also like Zomato in India is that they just work on labor arbitrage. So all they're doing is actually exploiting people and taking that market over. And so just stronger labor laws also help to ensure that actually some markets don't need to be platformized or, digitized at all. And so then you don't have to deal with this question of foreign capital or a monopolized market, because there doesn't need to be a platform for food delivery if you really think about it, because the efficiency is only coming from labor exploitation.
Thank you. The gentleman at the front here, please.
Okay. I'll start my question. I was taking some notes during all the event. I'll start with the definition of digital sovereignty, one of Professor Belli, which says is the capacity to understand, develop, and regulate digital AI technology. So I was thinking about that like an individual, or if I am a state, a municipality, or even an organization, private company, or public company. Do you see any room, maybe I'm ignorant in the theme, but do you see any room for, based on like a risk assessment, we set such kind of digital sovereignty indexes? What I mean with this is how I am adherent to a digital sovereignty concept. If I'm going to start right now, how adherent I am. So maybe I'm not, I'm very far, maybe it's just a concept that I'm still pursuing, or it's something that I can materialize in actions that will be fulfilled during the time, certain period of time, and based on that, I can compare my organization, my state, my country against others, see how I'm doing. Just this reflection based on what I'm seeing today.
Anyone want to respond to that? Yeah, please.
I mean, we cannot provide a specific answer since, as you saw, digital sovereignty has provoked different understandings. But in synthesis, it comprises among 3 different levels, the state level, so you can think there are several indexes comparing ICT infrastructure, capacities in terms of education, capacity of energy provision, of cybersecurity, of regulatory expertise, and so on. But you can also think of the industrial economic level, so I mean, how the state or the country itself has different companies providing different specific services, not only transactional platforms, as you mentioned, iFood, but also promoting research and development to develop specific, more in-depth products. There are also some indexes regarding this. There are also the individual level. There you can think of comparing human rights approaches in different countries, how countries are really able to develop and have agency and control and determine their own digital futures. And you can even think a more a collective self-determination as well approach. So see different non-governmental organizations, and the extent to which there are these social movements, NGOs, also developing, claiming, and using this concept for their own political purpose, which is quite legitimate. Because you say, maybe it's not the proper concept, but if indigenous communities, they develop themselves their own agenda for data sovereignty, I think they should move forward with that. The same with social movement and workers' movement. They're doing the same in Brazil. If you Google popular digital sovereignty, the homeless workers movement is also promoting their own perspective on that. But it's not about the indexes, but how the concept can have different ways of measuring it. Yeah.
Thanks. Any more questions? Yeah.
Quick one, just I would like to hear Jay's inputs. It was really interesting what you said about don't having to be platformized. These elements you mentioned, I think the house, we don't have to have an automated house and it imposes risks. I would like to hear your personal inputs based on your research on the myth of autonomy, of private autonomy. Alexandre said self-determination, but I think it's the myth of autonomy. Are we really, because from your presentation, I thought that you had something more on this matter to say, and I would love to hear. Thank you.
I think that the concept of autonomy that was promoted by digital platforms was one of individual choice. So if you want to be on the platform, that's your individual choice, and being on the platform allows you to choose between different services and, you know, tailor your advertisement to yourself. And a lot of this was translated, of course, to data protection law, where it was about individual choice. But we have seen over the last several years, I think, that autonomy is really meaningful when it's collective, when, you know, the environment around you is set in a certain way where you have real choice. And so I think that if you live in a country with a lot of unemployment and the only jobs available are gig work jobs, you know, this is not choice where you're doing, which was the concept of the sharing economy, which was promoted earlier, right? And so I think that the more we talk about collective rights, and, you know, sovereignty is just like the national level of those collective rights, the better chance we have of actual individual autonomy. So this is why, again, the farmers' movement talks about collective agricultural rights rather than just, you know, I as a farmer want digitalization or don't want digitalization. And I think perhaps that, I don't know if MST in Brazil already has a digital agenda, but I can imagine that they also think of this similarly, if you want to.
Yeah, both the landless workers movement, but also the homeless workers movement, and also indigenous communities, they have their own digital agendas. And I'll be glad to share with that, because I'm involved with that, but not now.
Great. Do we have time for one more question? I do have one, in case nobody else wants to ask. Okay, the one I wanted to ask was, we haven't, amazingly in this panel, we haven't yet really touched on AI. And it is an obvious question. You know, do we see in the near term or the medium term the possibility of, you know, DPIs, which include, you know, whether they're small AI models, big, you know, big language models? How would those come about? Who would like to respond to that? So maybe Armando and then Maria.
Yeah, actually, since the definition is not actually set in stone, and it can also encompasses standards and protocols and other kind of things that supports the core functions of what a DPI is currently. LLMs could be also be considered part of a DPI spec. Yeah. No matter if there's a small or a large model, depends on its criticality for the functioning of a certain platform, of a key government service or private sector as well, that is supported by the public by a public institution as well. So yeah, in a way, it could be considered. Yeah, it could be in the near future considered as part of this.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think I mentioned AI when I was talking about, and I thought you were just going to let it pass it, so thank you for that. But I do think it's already happening, that type of conversation. In Brazil, a few weeks ago, the government announced that they will be using AI to address fraud within the Bolsa Familia program. But again, it's interesting, that was the only information that we had. And then again, we are talking about this broader techno-solutionism narratives going on. So I think it speaks to our recommendations when it comes to a broader public conversation, participation, impact assessments, both in terms of privacy, in terms of human rights impact, that's for sure. And it's also interesting to see that type of announcement not long after there was a big case in the Netherlands of using AI for welfare programs, and it was a huge disaster with people, you know, from committing suicide to children being taken from their homes. So it is interesting to see how we are not very in tune with, you know, in these conversations. If we start to bring other stakeholders to the table, we might start to think about that in a more better informed way. But yeah.
Wonderful. So we are exactly on time. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. And I'm sure Luca has some spectacular conclusions for us now.
Right. So I will be very brief, because we have been here speaking for an entire day about very exciting issues. First, let me offer you an apology. I was not here for part of this afternoon because there are a lot of interesting debates today that stem from the CrowdStrike failure this morning that affected pretty much all banks and airplane companies around the world. So maybe if you are flying today, you might have some disruption because or you will receive a handwritten ticket because many of the companies rely on the software, well, on one of the Microsoft platform that relies on CrowdStrike as a security solution. And so I was speaking with journalists this afternoon on this. But I'm very excited about the discussion we had during the whole day. I am entirely exhausted by these 3 last days that have been very rich, exhausted but very happy because I rarely had such a blend of very interesting, stimulating discussions with such very passionate and interesting people. So I'm very happy to be able to have this moment with you, to share this moment with you, because it's really moments that are highly enriching for me. And I see from the conversation I have with others that there are a lot of ideas floating around, and then usually during coffees or dinners or lunches, those ideas aggregates, and there are a lot of people telling me, why you should work on this, why haven't you thought about that? And again, even the comments, I would like really to thank and to praise the participants that have been asking comments, asking questions and making comments. Well, it's a blend. We should find a new word for a question that is a comment, because it's what usually happens at conferences. So asking questions and making comments that have been very useful for the progress of the discussion. We also want to urge you to give us your feedback about the conference. Everyone seems very enthusiastic, telling me how wonderful it is, but I mean, I'm very happy for this, but there are always things that we can do better, right? Every year we receive some criticism, which is positive criticism, right? We are very open, so if you think there is something that has not worked well or we should include, feel free to either write us or tell us now, you should change this, because it's really something we are open to. And also ideas for the next year. Again, yesterday during the concluding plenary session, I was mentioning the fact that if we had dedicated a lot of attention this year to G20 things, next year we could dedicate attention to BRICS things, or more global South things, considering that the Brazilian presidency of the BRICS of next year, or even or to environmental things, considering also the Brazilian Brazil will host COP30 next year. So there are a lot of things that could be merged into the discussion we have here, and we are always open to your suggestions to make the conference better, and also to have maybe some side event as this one that could fit well into the formula. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you very much for those who have been with us for 3 days until now. You deserve a prize. We don't have one, but you have all our gratitude.